Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to discuss about diffusion and osmosis. But before starting with diffusion and osmosis, I would like to get you introduced with how transportation actually takes place in plants and animals, because somewhere we are going to link this diffusion and osmosis with the plant transport. So let's get started now. Transport in plants. And we know that the plants can be either tall or short in height. Now, in these plants, different forms of transportation are there. If the plant is small, it will not need to transport water to great heights, right? So here in small plants, we have only short distance transport in the plant. The first type of transport in plants, that is short distance transport. Short distance transports. Now, this short distance transport is also seen in case of tall trees, but it is not only the method of transportation in them. The another method is long distance transport, which is also seen in case of tall trees. So remember, in small plants which have very small height, which are of small size, they will not have specific tissues for long distance transport, but the tall trees like gymnosperms and angiosperms are going to have the long distance transport, long distance transport. Clear? Now this short distance transport is usually termed as transportation. And this long distance transport is termed as translocation. So guys, xylem and phloem both helps in translocation. Xylem for water minerals conduction, phloem mainly for food. Now these are two terms. Coming to this short distance transport, we have two types of short distance transport. The first one is passive and the second one is active. We are just going towards our main topic, that is osmosis and diffusion. So because we need to have the idea about what we are studying, I'm just telling you about this complete flow chart. So short distance transport can be either passive. Now we all know what does the word passive indicates. The word passive indicates that ATP will not be used. ATP is not used, and I'm putting a cross to show that ATP consumption is not there in such type of short distance transport. And now the second one is active transport. Active transport in which the ATP will be consumed. So I'll put a tick mark to show that here ATP is going to be used. Now, this passive transport is further of two types. The first one we have got is diffusion. Passive transport, first type is diffusion. Now, what is this diffusion, guys? So, diffusion is actually a very simple thing. The substance, it can be solid, liquid, gas. We know there are three states of matter: solid, liquid, gas. Any of them can move from their higher concentration to lower concentration, and that is what diffusion is. Whenever a substance moves from its higher concentration to its lower concentration, we call it as diffusion. Now, this diffusion can be of solids, liquids or gases, but remember we have a statement over here. The diffusion in solids is more common as compared to diffusion of solids. Means the diffusion will take place in solids easily as compared to diffusion of solids, and the most easiest diffusion goes with the gases. Gases are the easiest to have this diffusion. Coming to next point about the diffusion, and that sometimes creates problems in our mind also, that is membrane required for the diffusion? So no, membrane is actually not required at all for this diffusion. Normally, if we see in our surroundings also, if I spray perfume here, then a person standing at distance from me will also smell the perfume. The reason, the molecules, the gaseous molecules of that perfume are getting diffused in the air and are reaching towards that particular person. So for diffusion, membrane can be present or cannot be present. In case of plants, cells are there, so cell membrane is there through which diffusion will take place. But in general also, if we say diffusion, then the diffusion of gases or in the air is the best example to remember that diffusion does not necessarily require the membranes. So let's start writing the points simultaneously. The first point I told you that here in diffusion, the transport of solid, liquid or gas means all the three states of matter takes place, and according to which order? According to their high concentration to low concentration. Means if I'm spraying over here, then here the molecules are of high concentration as compared to my surroundings. So the molecules of the spray will move from my side to other sides because of the concentration gradient. This difference in the concentration is actually known as concentration gradient. And remember, diffusion is always taking place from their high concentration to low concentration. Now, next point, membrane can be present or cannot be present. Means necessarily membrane presence is not required. So, membrane present or absent means even if membrane is present, diffusion can happen. If membrane is not present, diffusion can happen. Okay, so membrane present or absent. Next point, even if the membrane is present, the diffusion do not require any sort of membrane protein. Simply, we know that our cell membrane or any cells, if we are talking about the plants, the cell membrane of plants is made up of lipids. So, diffusion of lipid-soluble molecules will be done easily without the help of any proteins. And hence we can say that no membrane proteins are required for diffusion. In your NCERT 11th section, Plant Physiology, there is a differentiation table between the three forms of short distance transport, and they are the important points. A number of times and number of exams, those questions are asked from those points. So let's mark the next point, that no membrane proteins. Even if the membrane is present, no membrane proteins will be there. No membrane proteins. Then we have the next point with us, that because the membrane proteins are not there, diffusion is not a selective method. Means any molecule can get diffused, just the requirement is concentration gradient. Else the membrane will not select which molecule is getting diffused and which is not getting diffused. Right? So next point is not selective. Means the molecules to get diffused will not be selected by the cells or the membrane, not selective. We need to remember this difference table actually. Next is no transport saturation. Actually what happens if the proteins are there, then they get saturated. But here what I said, a lipid membrane is there like this. Bilipid cell membrane is there. And if the molecules will just transfer across this membrane, they can transport as number of molecules they want, right? So diffusion does not reach saturation, it does not reach to any limit. So next point we have is no saturation. No saturation, simply we can say no limit of diffusion is there. Reason? Because here the diffusion takes place, means this process takes place through the bilayer lipid membrane itself. No rule of proteins or any sort of carriers are there. Just imagine you, a number of people are there who need to go to a particular place from a particular point. Now, if they are going by themselves, means by walking, they can we can just send a number of people without any limit. But what if we need a carrier to transport people from one spot to another? Every time we have to manage that, okay, now the carriers are full. That fulfillment of carriers is actually known as saturation. So I hope now this point of saturation is clear in your mind 100%. It's very simple. Saturation means a limit is reached after which the carriers cannot transport, the substance cannot get passed through it. The last point, if ATP is not used in the diffusion, we call this kind of process as downhill process, or we can say it's not a uphill process. Clear? So diffusion is not an uphill process. Remember this point. Next we have the second type of passive transport, and that is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion. So guys, this diffusion, facilitated diffusion are similar at some points and they have some differences also. We need to keep in mind both the points. Like how facilitated diffusion is related with diffusion, or it has similarities with diffusion. What are the dissimilarities with diffusion? What are the similarities with active transport, and what are the dissimilarities? So simply if you will see this comparative chart over here with the line diagram, you will recall everything, because apart from this, no question is going to be asked in the exams. You can make this thing sure. This is the concept on which the questions will be asked in the exam. So let's write the points for this facilitated diffusion. First point, we know that ATP is not used in this sort of transportation. Now, I'll just relate with the word itself, facilitated. Facilitated means what? Providing some sort of facility so that the function can be performed easily. Here, what is the function? Transportation. So if the transportation is done along with some support, we call it as facilitated diffusion. And here, the membrane is definitely involved. In case of facilitated diffusion, membranes are involved. And what sort of membranes? Membranes with specific proteins are there. So as I told you, if a substance is lipid soluble, or we can say the fat loving one, then it will get into the cell through the lipid bilayer. But what if the molecule or any substance which is supposed to get transported from one cell to another, it is not fat loving, it is water loving, hydrophilic sort of substances, polar substances. So such substances will be transported across the membrane with the help of specific proteins. What sort of molecules? We can call them as hydrophilic, water loving, polar molecules. These molecules will not be able to transport, or one more form of molecule, large size molecule. So I'll speak for again. First one is hydrophilic or water loving, both have the same meanings. Then polar molecules, and the last one is large sized molecules. If such molecules are supposed to be transported, then they will require specific proteins present in the cell membrane. We know that in between the lipid bilayer, we have some proteins present, right? You have studied the cell chapter. So here the specific proteins are there, and these proteins will actually help the substances to move across the cell membrane. These substances can be, I'll just write you over here so that you will remember. They can be hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means water loving. They can be polar, or they can be large sized molecule. So such molecules will require specific proteins. These specific proteins of the membrane are actually known as channel proteins or tunnel proteins. Right? So tunnel will give you a passage, means will give the molecules a passage to transport. So let's write the points about facilitated diffusion. First one, membrane with specific proteins. It will include membrane with specific proteins. What these proteins are known as? These proteins are known as channel proteins or tunnel proteins, which will act as a form of gate. When you enter some place, you will see some doors, or we can say channel gates. So those channel gates are the only passage through which you can cross, right? In the same way, these hydrophilic polar or large size molecules are the molecules which can transport across these proteins only. They cannot cross the lipid bilayer without these proteins. So we can call them as channel proteins, or we can also call them as tunnel proteins. Okay, now next point, because the proteins are there which are actually the carriers, the transporters, just like a vehicle will carry us from one place to another. These proteins are the carriers of these substances across the membrane. If the proteins are completely occupied, we can say they have reached the limit. This point is known as saturation. So we can say that the transport saturates, because when the proteins are completely occupied, we call transport saturations. For example, you are booking for some movie tickets and you see that the house is full. So what does mean? It means that the cinema hall is saturated now, no more entry will be given. Just like this, if the transport is saturated, no more molecules will be transported until and unless unsaturation again occurs. Until and unless the theater becomes empty, you cannot, means the people leave the theater, you cannot enter the theater for the next show, right? So let's write the next point. In this sort of transport, it saturates. So transport saturates means reaches the limits. Saturates. Next point is, because here the proteins are there, these proteins are highly selective. Specific proteins are going to select specific molecules to transport them across the membrane. Right? So next point is highly selective. Means if they don't have their specific carriers, they will not get transported across the membrane. Highly selective. Right? Next is, here no ATP is going to be used. So we can call that this point, this sort of transport is also a downhill process, or it is not also a uphill process, because the transport will take place from its higher concentration to lower concentration. So guys, whenever the transport takes place from higher concentration to lower concentration, then ATP is not used, and the type of transport is known as passive transport. And what two forms are there? Either diffusion or facilitated diffusion will be there. Next we have is active transport, in which the transport will take place from lower concentration to higher concentration. So can I say here that the transportation is taking place against the concentration gradient? Yes, because in the case of active transport, the transportation takes place from lower concentration of the molecules to higher concentration. So this type of transport is known as active transport, or here we can also call it as an uphill transport. So I'll write the points about the active transport over here. And the first point we have is that it is an uphill transport. Uphill transport because energy is used and the molecules travel from lower concentration to higher concentration. Coming to next point, guys, because energy is used, a cell will be there to provide the energy. This cell is going to provide energy in the form of ATPs, right? So we need proper membranes who are going to allow the molecules with the use of ATP to enter or exit the cells. So next point is membrane proteins are used. Membrane, just a minute. Membrane proteins are used. Here guys, so here what is being used? The proteins present in the cell membrane are used. These membrane proteins are actually known as pumps. For example, from the tank you need to fill the tank present on your terrace of the water. So you need to use pump, right? Because you are sending the water from the bottom to the heights. Like that, when the cells need to transport molecules from their less concentration to higher concentrations, what do they use? They use pumps to transport the materials. Since the proteins are used, you can easily remember that the transport will be highly selective. Highly selective. For example, sodium ion carriers will only transport sodium ions. They are not going to choose any other ion like potassium ions, or none of the other ion is being used by the sodium ion carriers. Another point, the transportation saturates because carriers are here, so transportation will saturate. Transportation saturates. Clear? Now, this is what type of transport? This is uphill kind of transport. This is all about the diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport. Now, next we have got is the significance of diffusions. So various important roles are placed by the diffusion actually in the case of plants, and I'm going to tell you about all those diffusions very fast and then I'll tell you about the osmosis. So the first diffusion significance is that the gaseous exchange which occurs during the photosynthesis. We know that plants use carbon dioxide and release oxygen during photosynthesis. So this exchange of gases is actually done by the diffusion process, because when the plants are using CO2, they will require more and more CO2. So in the atmosphere, the concentration of CO2 will be higher as compared to within the plants. So CO2 will enter, and during photosynthesis, oxygen is released in the plants. So concentration of oxygen will be higher in the plants as compared to the surrounding atmosphere in the air. So oxygen will diffuse out. Now coming to the another function where diffusion plays role is respiration. Now this time in case of respiration, it's reverse of photosynthesis, rest all is same. Coming to next point, the process of diffusion is involved in the transpiration of water vapors. Transpiration means what? Loss of water in the form of water vapors in the form of evaporation. Actually evaporation occurs, so we call it as transpiration. So what happens? The plant surface has high concentration, means the plant cells will have more concentration of water as compared to the surrounding air. So this air will have less water concentration and will receive water molecules in the form of water vapor through the process of diffusion. So we got three important factors actually, or functions of the diffusion in the case of plants. The next one is the smell of the flowers, because the aromatic compounds which are volatile are released by the flowers. The smell of the flowers is like spreads over long distances because of the diffusion only, and this is playing a great role for the plants because it helps in pollination. The insects, animals get attracted to the plants because of the beautiful smell or very sweet smell they produce, and they spread the smell by diffusion. Next is during passive salt uptake, means when the roots are absorbing or taking the salts without any use of energy. The ions are used by or taken by the help of diffusion process. Next is for translocation of food materials also. So food material is translocated or transported over short distances by diffusion. And next is gaseous exchange in submerged hydrophytes. So those plants which are present in the water bodies, these are known as submerged hydrophytes, means underwater. In below the water surface, if they are present, we call them as submerged hydrophytes, and in them the gaseous exchange actually takes place by the diffusion through the general surface. So these are some significance of the diffusion. Now let's see the osmosis. So guys, osmosis is actually a specific type of diffusion. Osmosis we can see not only in plants but in our regular life also. I'll give you examples for the osmosis when I'll tell you types of osmosis which you can see, which you can even do the experiments also. Generally in schools, such experiments are performed. Even in my school life, I performed such experiments just for fun because we studied, we performed the experiments out of fun. So let's put the heading first, osmosis. Now, this osmosis, as I told you, is a specific type of diffusion. So here, the diffusion of only and only the liquids take place. Solids and gases do not have anything to do with osmosis. Means they are not going to transport through the osmosis. Transportation of solids and liquids is done only by diffusion. Means if I talk about the passive transport. So coming to this osmosis, it is a special type of diffusion of liquids only. Only and only the transport of liquids will be done. No role of or no transport of solids or gases is here. Here what happens in a solution, two things are there. We studied in the junior classes, means in 9th, your chapter number 2 in science is that a solution comprises of two parts. One is solute and another one is solvent. Even in chemistry also you study in your this 11th and 12th classes. Solution comprises of solute and solvent. Solute is the material which is present in the less amount, and solvent is the substance which is present in high amount. So if a solution is there, usually it is liquid, which is present in higher amount, and this solvent is actually going to transport across the membrane. So next point is, in case of osmosis, membrane is required. Membrane required means without the presence of membrane, the osmosis is not done. So a barrier, like any sort of membrane, either natural or synthetic, should be there for the osmosis to occur. Here in the case of osmosis, the solvent molecules. Solvent transports across, means through a semi-permeable membrane, or we can call it as a selectively permeable membrane, which is going to select. So semi-permeable membrane means which is going to allow only and only solvents. So solvent transports across semi-permeable membrane from less concentrated solution. Now guys, this point is very important, creates confusion in our minds even though we are clear with it. So solvent transports from less concentrated solution to more concentrated solution. Now, what is this less concentrated solution and more concentrated solution? So usually students do get confused. So I'm going to explain this part first, then we'll talk about the osmosis further. So less concentrated solution means the amount of solute will be less. The amount of solute will be less, or we can say they have high diffusion pressure. This diffusion pressure is actually a hypothetical term which explains the ability of molecules or ions of any substance to diffuse from area of their high concentration to lower concentration. So less concentrated solution means what we are talking about. Less concentrated solution means we are talking about less or decreased concentration of solute. Whereas more concentration means increased concentration of solute. Or another point you can also add over here, that the transport goes from higher diffusion pressure. Now this diffusion pressure is according to the solvent molecule. So from higher solvent diffusion pressure, they are going towards the less diffusion pressure. Usually, from which point you will get the questions? You will get questions from this point. So I'm marking 2 stars over it. So what is diffusion pressure, guys? I'll again tell what is diffusion pressure. So diffusion pressure is actually a hypothetical term. It is not a original thing, or we can say it's just an imaginary thing or imaginary term which explains the ability of molecules or ions of any substance to diffuse from an area of their high concentration to low concentration. Now, here we are done with this concept of osmosis. Next we have is types of osmosis. So osmosis is basically of 2 types. So let's make the flow chart. Osmosis, and 2 types are there. We have been studying from our junior classes, guys. You all know the 2 types. Nothing new in that. First is endoosmosis. And the second one is exosmosis. Endo means what? Inside. So if the solution comes, means the solvent comes into the cell, then we call it as endoosmosis. And if the solvent or water moves out of the cell, then we call it as exosmosis. Very easy to remember, nothing typical here. Example, in your house you can perform this example. Take some resins, put them in water for some time, and then you observe. You will see that the resins swell. The reason? Because the resins are having high concentration. I'm writing on the side so that you will remember. Resins are having high concentration, or they are highly concentrated. Clear? Now these resins are placed in what? They are placed in water. So water will enter into the resins, right? And this process of entrance is known as endoosmosis. Another example we have for endoosmosis, the marine animals are placed in the freshwater bodies, then the marine animals will get endoosmosis. So these are 2 examples which you need to remember. Then we come to the exosmosis, and this time again you can do an experiment. Take grapes. Okay, in the season of grapes, take them and put them in some concentrated sugar solution or concentrated salt solution. You will see that slowly and slowly they will just get shrink. The reason? The water which is present in the grapes will move out from the less concentrated solution to high concentrated solution. In general also, do nothing, just take some grapes and put them. So you will see that slowly and slowly they shrink. Reason? They are losing water because of exosmosis. So here you got the answer for your question, and the reason is because of exosmosis, the water moves from the less concentrated solution to more concentrated solution, or water moves from their high concentration to their less concentration. Clear? So these are 2 types of osmosis. Next we have is types of solution, guys. So let's put the heading types of solution. Types of solution. So basically we have 3 types which we have been studying from our junior classes again. So the first one we have got is hypotonic. Hypotonic. Now, hypo means what? Hypo represents the term less. Hypo means less. So, if the solution whose osmotic concentration is less than the other solution or cell sep, then we call the solution as hypotonic. I'll repeat, which is which has the concentration less than the another solution in which it is placed. Next we have is number 2, hypertonic. Hypertonic means the solution which has high concentration as compared to the solution or cell sap in which it is placed. So this is the word hyper, which means more. Next is point number type number 3, that is isotonic. Iso means same. So when the concentration of two solutions is same, then we call them as isotonic. So if I say that this is one beaker and this is one cell, if I say that I'm placing a cell in the hypotonic solution, then what is going to happen, guys? Answer fast, think the answer fast. If a cell is placed on hypotonic solution, means less concentrated solution, then it will have endoosmosis. The water is going to enter inside the cell. Second condition we have, if I place a cell in hypertonic solution, this time what is going to happen? The water molecules will come out of the cell, the shrinking of the cell will be done. But one point over here I want to tell you, if the water enters into the cell, plant cell never bursts. Plant cell does not burst. The reason, asked in the exams, guys, this question has come in the exam because it has cell wall. So this is the reason, if a plant cell is placed in water, it will not burst due to endoosmosis because it has cell wall. But if an animal cell is placed in hypotonic solution, it will burst because of endoosmosis. So this question is asked a number of times in the exam. Do keep this point in your mind. Next, hypotonic solution, exosmosis occurs, shrinking of the cell occurs, plasmolysis term, and the third one, isotonic. So the exchange of water will be there, means the solution, but the net movement will be zero. Clear? So these are the three types of osmosis we have got. Next, we have a significance of osmosis. So first significance is that the absorption of water by plants is done by this osmosis process. Next is water movement. So the cell-to-cell water movement is done by the help of osmosis. Next is to maintain the rigidity of the plant organs. Osmosis plays great role. Fourth one is leaves can maintain their shape because of this osmosis process. Next is growing of the points of root so that they can penetrate in the soil, that roots are being turgid because of the endoosmosis. Next is opening and closing of stomata. In that, the guard cells suffer this osmosis process, endoosmosis, because of which stomatal pores occur. I'll discuss this opening and closing of stomata soon on my channel. So stay tuned. And to stay tuned, do subscribe my channel. And another significance is also that the movement of plants and plant parts. For example, we have this Indian telegraph plant leaflet. So some plants like Chui Mui, or we can say Touch Me Not plants, it's just a nickname, but it came to my mind. So these plants, if we touch them, they just get rolled up, or the leaflets will get rolled up. This is because of the osmotic concentrations or osmosis which occurs in them. So guys, to know about this, how the osmosis is decided, about the diffusion pressure deficit, how the plant transport is decided in the cells and the solution, stay tuned. I'll be soon uploading new videos to tell how the water transport is decided by this different pressures and potentials. So here we are done with the osmosis and diffusion. Please like this video and subscribe to stay tuned with my upcoming videos to get help for your exams, and do share it with your friends too so that they can also learn about these topics.